Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Almost.
Yeah.
Still morning. Thought after Representative Bradford's questions we would have been into afternoon, but we weren't yet. So it's good we have a timer.
Yeah.
But back to the farm show grounds. I had some other questions, but I think the importance of the issue that occurred here around the farm show grounds, and then ultimately the money that you have borrowed that we're going to pay back. That was initially put out as an RFP, but then was changed then to the financing agreement. So when the RFP was put out for the leaseback, four companies had responded to that RFP, and one of those companies was the company that ultimately signed this financing agreement.
Yes, sir.
So do you believe the RFP is the same as the financing agreement?
I do.
So do the other three parties that bid on the RFP, through the RFP process, do you believe that they would be under the same understanding that it's the same thing, the financing agreement?
I do.
It's just, I think for all of us that have been concerned about the direction this was going, I think there's a lot of us that don't believe it's the same thing, of course. And have you had any indication that any of the other three parties that they're all okay with the way that this process played out, or are any of them aggrieved to the point that they might actually be following up with some action in addition to what's already been taken to try and intervene in what's occurring?
We have had no protests.
So you mentioned earlier that the Attorney General had signed off on this. And I have the document here that was issued by his office. Well, actually, this was from the General Counsel's office. So did the Attorney General sign off on the contract itself in full, in its entirety? And did he, in addition to that, sign off on you executing this agreement that DGS has not been involved in executing in the past in the way of financing agreements?
Yes, sir. The contract followed the normal contract signature process in the Commonwealth, which involves the Office of Attorney General.
But as far as a contract, I mean, it's still a financing agreement, which is outside of the norm for what you're normally signing and what he's approving through those processes. Isn't that correct? You said this was the first time that this type of an agreement had been executed by DGS.
I believe that's correct, yes.
So in the financing agreement memo that I had that was dated January 29th from the Governor's Office of Chief Counsel, it says towards the end of it, to the extent applicable to the reference document, no approval or opinion is offered as to the fiscal authority of the agency to commit funds not yet appropriated. But within the agreement, then I have the memo also from the Office of the Attorney General, which gives the same line is there also. To the extent applicable to the reference contract, no approval or opinion is offered as the fiscal authority of the agency to commit funds not yet appropriated. So in the agreement, the financing agreement, were you not committing funds for that $2+ million that was being paid in fees and such that were part of the agreement? Isn't that committing funds? And if it, I mean, either way, it seems like the little disclaimers that seem to be in the Attorney General's memo and the Chief Counsel's memo, both seems like they've got their own disclaimers in here that would lead you to believe that they really didn't approve the document in full, the proposal.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'm told that that language is the standard cover memo that they put on every contract.
The language in the memos from the chief counsel and the attorney general's office.
That's correct.
So they have a standard disclaimer for any contract they're reviewing that might lead you to believe that they didn't really fully approve the entirety of the document that they're claiming that they've approved.
As I testified earlier, virtually all of the Commonwealth's expenditures are and long-term contract obligations are subject to appropriations from the General Assembly. That's pretty standard.
And I would think they are subject to the appropriations from the General Assembly, which is what concerns me, that in number 12 of the financial agreement, the fees, commissions, and expenses, DGS shall pay all expenses incident to the issuance of the certificates of participation not to exceed $2.375 million. Did the General Assembly approve that money to be spent, to be appropriated?
The payments aren't scheduled until fiscal year 1920.
So you're expecting that we're still going to have to approve an appropriation to pay that $2.375 million?
Just as we would for every other multi-year financial obligation that every agency in the Commonwealth enters into through contract.
But this, you said this is the first time your agency has ever executed a document like this.
It's the first time that this agency has executed a document with this intent. We execute contracts on a daily basis.
But not to borrow $200 million and pay back almost $400 million.
All of the contracts that the agency executes involve financial obligations that are subject to appropriations.
So the interest on the $200 million that you, for the first time ever, signed a financial agreement on as a department, you've got a real sweetheart deal here, because you borrowed $200 million, and we get to pay back $177.5 plus million, along with paying another $2 to $2.5 million in fees and service fees. So, I mean, for the average person out there, it's looking like you're paying back close to $400 million to borrow $200. It's really around $380 million that we're paying back to borrow $200 million. I think that the General Assembly really needs to work with our legal team to thoroughly vet this before we would ever give a dime to an appropriation that's going to pay for what's been entered into through this financing agreement for the first time ever. And I would strongly advise you not to consider entering any more financial agreements like this until the General Assembly has vetted this one and determined whether or not this was a proper use of your department's resources to actually do something like this for the very first time and commit the Commonwealth that we've been told from one of your advisors isn't a constitutional debt issuance, but that you're committing us to paying back debt, almost $200 million in addition to $180 million in addition to the $200 million that you're borrowing for the first time ever through this type of an agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.